All right. Hey, folks. Welcome to our next meeting. I'm going to share a PDF here in messages with everybody. Oop. There we go. So this week we're looking at a figure who isn't a rabbi. We've been focusing pretty heavily on individuals from the rabbinic tradition up to this point. But I also want to focus from time to time on individuals who may not have been rabbis or in the rabbinic orbit, but who also play an important role in the sort of makeup of Jewish thought over the centuries. And so, given the amount of time and energy that we've been spending going over the Great Revolt, right? The events leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple. I think we'd be doing ourselves a disservice not to take a moment to take a look at Josephus and who he is and what he was about and what his historical legacy is. So Josephus, originally Yosef ben Matityahu, is primarily known as a historian. He is the author of a number of works that are focused primarily on on trying to write the history of the Jewish people in a Hellenistic mode. He's writing in Greco-Roman fashion, right? So in that regard, he's kind of a liminal figure in Jewish history, right? On the one hand, he himself is Jewish, and he's writing as a Jew and very much writing about Jewish subjects, but he's writing in a particularly Greek and Roman mode of, history in the Greco-Roman style. And he's writing primarily to a Roman audience, right? So in that regard, he's kind of existing kind of at this kind of middle ground, right? He's existing somewhere on the borderland between Judaism and the broader Hellenistic culture of that time. And I think for that very reason, he's kind of an interesting historical figure. So what do we know about Josephus? Well, first of all, a great deal of what we know about Josephus, we know about him from his own writings. He himself is an important figure in the works of history that he writes, and he wrote an entire autobiography of himself. And because we are so dependent on his autobiography to know about the details of his life, we need to pay attention to the fact there's some reason to believe that he was maybe more than usually interested in presenting himself in a positive light to his audience. And this, of course, raises all sorts of questions as to the degree of objectivity that we can find in his account of his life and in the events of the Great Revolt. In this regard, he's not really so different from other historians of antiquity. At that particular time, there tended to be a much more heavy focus on the underlying ideas and values of a historical work than on their objective, veracity, on the actual facticity of the things that they were writing. Academic history as such hadn't really developed as a discipline, and so historians at the time tended to be a lot more polemical than modern historians are supposed to be. There was a lot less concern with getting your sources absolutely right. There was much more of a willingness to write from personal accounts and from hearsay. It was a much less rigorous and thoroughly vetted form of historical knowledge than what we're maybe used to expecting in modern versions of historical historiography, right? That doesn't mean that what he has to write isn't valuable, but it does mean that we should take anything that he says, particularly anything that he says about himself, with a grain of salt, right? Because like many historians of the era, he's got an agenda behind what he's writing. And I think with regard to Josephus, the agenda itself that he has from time to time is just as interesting as anything that he's as any of the details that he's actually setting down as history, right? Because the agenda that he's got in writing his works of history are themselves an outgrowth of his life and the issues that he was facing in his life, and the series of events that happen to him and that he takes part in that ultimately result in a situation where he feels that it's very much upon him to sort of set the record straight, as it were, and to present a positive account of his life and achievements. So what do we know about Josephus? He was born in Jerusalem around 37 of the Common Era. So he's not a BCE guy, he's a CE guy. He was born into an aristocratic priestly family, so fairly upper class, and belonged to the sort of priestly caste, right? He was a Cohen. In his autobiography, he says that he studied the different Jewish schools of thought that existed at the time, including those of the Essenes and the Sadducees and the Pharisees. He claims that he spent some time as a disciple of the Essenes out in the desert, but ultimately says that he decided ultimately to become a Pharisee. And he claims in his autobiography that he has been an adherent of the Pharisaic school of Judaism for most of his life. The actual accuracy of that is questioned to some extent by by later historical scholars, who sort of maybe imagine that that there are a number of political and social reasons why he might want to be claiming a greater degree of consistency and adherence to the Pharisaic kind of pre-rabbinic approach to Judaism than may have actually been the case. In any event, as a fairly young man, at the age of 26, he went to Rome on a delegation to advocate for the release of some priests, some Kohanim, who had been arrested and sent to Rome for reasons that Josephus regarded as trivial and illegitimate. That mission was successful. He did manage to successfully advocate for those priests' release. And then when he returned to Judea, he arrived back kind of right around the beginning of the political unrest that became the Great Revolt, right? So we've talked about the Great Revolt a number of times. If you remember, there was a great deal of social unrest in the Jewish part of the Roman Empire, specifically around the mismanagement and kind of rapacious government of the Roman procurators, who were trying to gain as much money as they possibly could in the taxes, and they were not, and it was leading to a lot of social unrest. So the Great Revolt breaks out. There are some initial military successes in driving out at least some of the Roman troops. They managed to defeat the Roman legate of Syria, Cestus Gallus. And at that point, the overall sort of leadership of the rebellion, which is based more or less in Jerusalem, starts appointing, military commanders and generals to sort of for the defense of Judea against the Romans. Josephus himself is appointed military governor of the Galilee by the leadership in Jerusalem, which means he's put in charge of the defense of the various Galilean cities against the forces of Rome that were sent in to quell the rebellion. So a big part of the history of the history of the Jewish wars that he writes is devoted to the military campaign that the Romans waged to reconquer the Galilee. And of course, Josephus himself played an important role in that conflict. He presents himself, of course, as being a very able general and, as employing all kinds of clever stratagems to fortify the cities and defeat the Romans. And at the same time, he's engaged in a certain amount of conflict with with another military leader of the rebellion, whose name was John of Giscala, who was sort of a rival of Josephus, and who, of course, doesn't come across well in Josephus's writings, right? So, despite the best efforts of the rebels, the Roman army eventually manages to retake the Galilee. When the city that they were defending was captured, Josephus was trapped in a cave with 40 of his fellow rebels. And according to the story that he tells, the rebels were determined to commit suicide rather than be captured by the Romans. And so they work out this sort of, plan where they're going to sort of draw lots, and basically each person is going to kill the previous person, and they're going to, commit suicide that way. So Josephus, and at the very end, Josephus and one other man were the last remaining. And at that point, Josephus, who claims in his writings to have been pretty much not have high hopes about the Jews' ability to ultimately defeat Rome from the very beginning, he manages to convince the other man to surrender with him. And so he surrenders to the Romans, and he's taken into the Roman camp before the general Vespasian, who you may recall from our discussion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Josephus takes the exact same approach to Vespasian as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did. In other words, he prophesies that Vespasian is going to eventually become the emperor. He remains under Roman custody for a couple of years, about 2 years, until the summer of 69. And at that point, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor, at which point he releases Josephus from his chains. Josephus apparently plays some kind of a negotiating role toward the end of the siege of Jerusalem. He seems to have cast himself in a somewhat prophetic light. He compares himself to the prophet Jeremiah, who prophesied the downfall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, as recorded in the book of Jeremiah. And he encouraged the people of Jerusalem to surrender. Of course, as you know from the history we've already covered, Jerusalem doesn't surrender, and the city was ultimately taken in 70 of the Common Era, and the temple was destroyed. So this is when Josephus's history becomes particularly controversial from a specifically Jewish standpoint, because after the war, Vespasian's son Titus, who had remained in Judea acting as general while Vespasian went back to Rome to be the emperor, Titus took Josephus back to Rome. Vespasian granted Josephus Roman citizenship. He was sort of patronized by the noble family of Flavius, which is why he's now known, he's generally known as Flavius Josephus. He sort of took on that family name. He became a Roman citizen, and he was provided with a pension and a large estate in Judea. And that's pretty much where he remained for the rest of his life. And for the rest of his life, he devoted himself to writing several books on Jewish history. And of course, the autobiography that talks about his, his life and times, right? And it's for these works of history that he's mainly known, right? When people talk about Josephus, they're very rarely talking about Josephus the general or Josephus the prophet. They're really talking about Josephus the historian, because it's in that respect that he's most, significant in Jewish history. So it might make sense at this point to kind of take a second and talk about what are the works, the historical works that are attributed to him. So in addition to his autobiography, there's 3 books that he writes, one of which is called The Jewish War. These are all translations from the Latin. The Jewish War, The Antiquities of the Jews, and another shorter work called Against Apion. So what's in these books? So the Jewish War, as you might expect, is a historical account of the wars of the Jewish people during the Greco-Roman period. So the book starts with the period of the Maccabees, in which the Jews were fighting against the Alexandrian Greek, Alexander the Great, sort of like post-Alexander Greek successor states. And then it continues on and finishes with the fall of Jerusalem and its immediate aftermath. That's sort of the period of history that's covered by the Jewish War. And like I said, in writing history, Josephus is typically of his time a very polemic historian. He's got a very specific editorial stance in his account of history. And the best way to characterize that stance is this way. He does his absolute best to justify both the majority of the Jewish population and the Roman government as such. He does his best not to justify both of those. And so he ultimately blames the war on what he calls an unrepresentative and overzealous faction of the Jews, i.e. the Zealots, who we've talked about before, and on poor governance by the Roman governors that had been appointed over Judea, the procurators, right? So he puts all the blame on the bad governors and the bad political radicals, and he tries his best to avoid placing any blame on the Jews as a whole or on the Roman Empire as such, right? And ultimately, his stance on the war is that it was ultimately misguided, and that there was no hope of the Jews actually winning, right? And that it was ultimately a bad idea for the sort of rebellious faction to sort of launch this war against Rome that they weren't able to, that there was no way they were going to win. In staking out that stance, it's pretty clear that Josephus is trying to present things in such a way, right, as to justify his particular stance, where he sort of like what he ended up doing, right, which was ultimately defecting to the Romans and ended up in a situation where he was basically being supported by the Roman government, right? From the standpoint of the Zealots, he was a traitor, right? From his own standpoint, he was simply acknowledging that there was really no way for the Jews to win at that time, and he was, accepting, at least de facto, the authority of the Roman Empire at that time. The way he described it, fortune had been given over to the Romans during that period in history, and so it was more or less necessary to submit to them. So that's his take on the Jewish War. The other main book that he writes is called The Antiquities of the Jews, right? Once again, that's a translation from the Latin in which he writes it. And this is actually, in some respects, an even more interesting book because it's a general text on the history and laws and customs of the Jewish people from the earliest beginnings, as recorded like at the beginning of the book of Genesis, all the way to the present day from at his time. And so he's covering a lot of material in his Antiquities of the Jews that is also covered, for example, by the historical and narrative portions of the Tanakh, right? He retells a lot of Bible stories, right? But he's presenting those stories, he's writing those stories, for one thing, in language that is understandable to the Roman population of his time. And he's also trying to present those stories in a way that Roman readers are going to understand culturally. So there's a kind of cultural translation that he is engaged in where he will present Jewish stories in a way that's going to make sense to people who are immersed in Hellenistic culture. That, in other words, the Greco-Roman culture that was sort of the majority culture of the Mediterranean at that time. So he talks, for example, about how Abraham, when he was living in Egypt, taught science to the Egyptians, right? He talks, for example, he compares how the priestly class that was established by Moses, the Kohanim, were sort of similar to the Roman Senate. He makes these kind of comparisons where he's sort of translating ideas and institutions from Jewish tradition into terms that are going to make sense to the Romans. And this is all part of a project that he's engaged in to try and sort of justify Judaism to the Romans, right? To present Judaism in such a way that it appears as a legitimate and worthwhile religion to his Roman readers. That general sort of attitude or approach is continued in his work Against Apion, which is a very plainly polemic work. It's not really a historical work at all. What that text mainly is, it's a defense of Judaism against anti-Jewish writers of his time. And the main stress of that defense is that he's emphasizing Judaism's antiquity, right? He emphasizes that Judaism is a very, very ancient tradition, that it actually predates the religious and philosophical tradition of the Greeks and the Romans, and makes a case that at least some of the ideas that are contained in Greco-Roman philosophy are sort of presaged, are sort of prefigured by a lot of stuff that crops up in Judaism, right? He's essentially presenting Moses, right, and the early Jewish prophets as kind of the sort of forefathers of Greek and Roman philosophy, and thus trying to present Judaism in a light that it's going to be regarded as a positive contribution to the religious and spiritual world of the Roman Empire, from the standpoint not just of the Jews, but also of non-Jews who are sort of, third party looking on. So what's interesting about all of this, right, is the way in which it highlights this thing about Josephus is that he exists in this liminal space. He is a Jew, and he identifies strongly with Judaism and the Jewish people. But at the same time, he ultimately defects to the Romans, takes on a Romanized form of his name, and is more or less kind of on the Roman side for a good chunk of his life. He tends to be regarded as a traitor by at least some of his fellow Jews at the time, but at the same time seems to have regarded his role as that of justifying Judaism to the Roman elites, who otherwise might have been inclined to look on Judaism as just another barbaric religion, right? Despite his claims to being a Pharisee, we can probably look at him as an example of another somewhat poorly understood branch of Jewish thought that tends to be obscured because it wasn't really held in any kind of high regard by the rabbis. And that's the idea of Hellenized Judaism, right? The idea of Judaism that tries to reconcile itself with the dominant Greco-Roman culture. There are other key figures of this, right? So the philosopher Philo is another example, right? In his case, someone who is trying very specifically to reconcile Greek philosophy with Judaism, right? But, and also this kind of general attitude of the idea of making Judaism and Greek culture sort of work together was maybe more characteristic of the attitude of the Jews who were living in the community in Alexandria in Egypt for many centuries. In any event, this sort of liminality of Josephus means that he's not really regarded by Jewish culture at all until the modern day. For most of history, his works were pretty much preserved by Christians and not by Jews. And it's only really recently as, with the sort of growth of something like a secular Jewish culture in the modern era, that Jewish scholars started going back to Josephus and kind of looking into him and reading his works as sort of a way of getting a different historical perspective on the same kind of material that we find in in the Tanakh, for example, right? So he kind of exists in that liminal space between, the Jews and the Romans, between the Jews and the Christians, right? He kind of occupies this really uncomfortable middle place. But he's also a really interesting sort of external historical source for a lot of stuff that otherwise we only have reference to in the rabbinic texts, for example, right? Which themselves have a very particular attitude and stance and agenda that they are serving, right? We can't necessarily take the rabbinical accounts as, the absolute truth, right? Because the rabbis were religious thinkers and they had a very particular agenda that they were trying to serve. So Josephus is really interesting in that regard as another perspective on the events of that period that was so important to the foundation of rabbinic Judaism, which is really what we're exploring here at this particular phase of this class. All of which is a whole lot of me talking. I want to take a moment to kind of open it up for questions and comments and thoughts before we take a look at some of his actual text. I brought a piece from the Wars of the Jews, and I brought a piece from the Antiquities of the Jews. It's a little bit wordy and verbose, right? He's writing in a Roman style as opposed to a Jewish style, but I want to delve into that just a little bit at least. But I want to open it up first for anybody's thoughts and questions at this point. Stacy.
So what value or why did the Romans offer him a job? What did he have to offer if only his intellect and writing abilities? Was he just a prize in the war that they got this person to switch sides, as you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, he was a figure of some political importance, at least originally, right? And I think that the way in which Vespasian determined to deal with him after the war was, in many respects, a political move in order to, right, the Romans have to show that it's really bad to rebel against them, but they also have to show that the people who actually go to their side and, play nice under the empire are going to be treated well. And Josephus, as a very prominent figure in the revolt, who ultimately goes over to the Romans and, ends up, justifying the Romans to a great extent, right? That's maybe politically valuable to the Roman Empire when dealing with a politically difficult Roman province. At least that's my take on it at any rate. Sharon, you have a hand up?
Dan.
Okay, Dan?
I've heard that there was a medieval, I guess, forgery, pseudo-Josephus. Was it far enough afterwards that there's no doubt about the text that we have, that it was all the original Josephus?
Yeah, so the main part of Josephus that I'm aware of personally, that historians have raised some real questions about, is in the Antiquities of the Jews, there's a fairly short piece of text that mentions Jesus. And the text, the way that it's written, some linguistic aspects of it, but even more than that, the sort of style in which it's written is, shall we say, suspiciously pro-Christian for an individual who at least publicly claimed to be a Pharisee, right? For example, the paragraph on Jesus, basically acknowledges Jesus to have been the Messiah, right? And to have been a divine figure, right? And that kind of language is not necessarily language that is at all consistent with the way that he writes on other subjects. And it certainly wouldn't be consistent with his general identification with the Pharisaic kind of religious program. And so some scholars have raised the question that the possibility that remember that Josephus's texts were being preserved and transmitted primarily in among Christian circles and not in Jewish circles, right? And there's a fairly, logical argument to be made that, when the medieval monks, right, are scribing his, works of history, and they come to a passage which maybe talks about Jesus in more neutral terms, right, that doesn't describe Jesus as the Son of God, but just as sort of, a teacher who acquired a lot of followers, right, and who people made various claims about, that those monks might have felt somewhat scandalized by that depiction of Jesus as just another person, right? And sort of rewritten that part to sort of more accurately reflect their ideas of who Jesus was, right? So that's, I think, primarily where the kind of pseudo-Josephus thing kind of creeps in as a possibility, that Josephus is writing about a period of time that includes the life of the historical Jesus, right? And that there's some textual evidence to suggest that that what he had to say about Jesus may have been rewritten in the Middle Ages as a way, because it was regarded as theologically unacceptable by the Christian scribes who were responsible for actually preserving and transmitting the text. It's a little bit hard to kind of know these things for certain, right? Because the text only comes down to it in the form that it comes down to us, and it wasn't preserved by the Jews because the Jews kind of hated Josephus because he was a traitor, right? But I think that there's maybe a good argument to be made for the idea that it was rewritten, because there's very little going on elsewhere in Josephus that really indicates that that we ought to regard him as a Christian or as a crypto Christian, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense given the other things that we know about it. So, Sharon.
It's been a long time since I read anything that he wrote, but I recall that I was riveted by his description of the burning of the temple, and that he was a really good writer, and the detail was very dramatic and it was very moving to read. So not as an historian, I don't know, but as a writer, I thought he was really good.
Yeah. I mean, I find him a little bit wordy sometimes, but that also could be the nature of the translation, right? This is one of those areas where, as a rabbi, there's a lot of Jewish texts that I feel very comfortable providing translation because I can check the translation. When it comes to stuff that was preserved for many centuries in Latin, that's an area where I don't have that linguistic skill, so I've ultimately got to take it at the word of various other scholars, right? So, but yeah, he's definitely got away with words, and I'm hoping we'll get a chance to kind of look at a little bit of that as we go. It's, like I said, it's a little bit wordy, but I want to get a representative sample of it. Anybody else got a quick question before we?
Yeah, just a question. I'm sorry if it sounds like a dumb question. He was a Kohen. He wasn't actually a rabbi. Is that my understanding?
He was not a rabbi at all.
Okay.
He was born a Kohen. He belonged
Okay.
to an aristocratic family, which most Kohanim were.
Mhm.
They were very
But-
upper class. He claims to have been a Pharisee. He was never regarded as a rabbi, and the rabbis the actual rabbis probably wouldn't have touched him with a 10-foot pole because of his kind of toxic history, like surrendering to Romans, right? The
Okay.
rabbis themselves were not fans of the zealots, as we've kind of found, right?
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that they would have regarded someone who was literally working for the Romans or who presented the Romans in a positive light as someone that they wanted to be associated with. So,
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
yeah. Okay. So I'm going to share this out one more time just to make sure that people have it. This is a PDF of some text that I grabbed off of Sepharia. And I want to take a look at, I've got two passages One is from the Jewish War, and one is from the Antiquity of the Jews. The passage from the Jewish Wars is a passage where he talks a little bit about the sort of political factions that were advocating in Jerusalem that were sort of like the zealots, right? And his sort of take on who these people were and why they were so nasty. And then the passage from Antiquities I picked because I think it's kind of interesting. It's his take on the episode in the book of Exodus where the Sea of Reeds is parted, which we all know very well, probably from the Torah's account and from the account that we read every year in Passover. It's his account of that, which is ultimately based on the Torah, but is also presenting it in a particular way. And it's good. I think it'll make it'll be useful for comparison and sort of in terms of seeing what he does as a Roman style historian with the historical material of Jewish culture that he's got to hand. So I'm going to share screen here. Feel free to take a look at your own document if you prefer it that way. There we go. Okay, so this first passage, which is 2 paragraphs, you can see it's kind of long, is coming from the Jewish War. It's for context, it's important to understand that he's talking about a period immediately after the defeat of the rebellion in the Galilee, right? When I think I said quite some time ago, right, after the Jewish revolt was defeated in the Galilee, a lot of the rebels ended up fleeing to Jerusalem. And that's the moment that he's talking about historically. The John that he's referring to here specifically is John of Giscala, who is a rival military commander who's associated with the revolt, who Josephus doesn't like very much. Does anyone feel like reading some wordy text for us tonight? My speaking voice is not too great this evening.
I'll read part of it.
All right, great. Thanks, Beth. Why don't you take the first paragraph?
Okay. Now upon John's entry into Jerusalem, the whole body of the people were in an uproar, and 10,000 of them crowded about every one of the fugitives that were come to them, and inquired of them what miseries had happened abroad, when their breath was so short and hot and quick that of itself it declared the great distress they were in. Yet did they talk big under their misfortunes, and pretended to say that they had not fled away from the Romans, but came thither in order to fight them with less hazard, for that it would be an unreasonable and a fruitless thing for them to expose themselves to desperate hazards about Giscala and such weak cities, whereas they ought to lay their weapons and their zeal and reserve it for their metropolis. But when they related to them the taking of Giscala and their decent departure, as they pretended from that place, many of the people understood it to be no better than a flight, and especially when the people were told of those that were made captives, they were in great confusion and guessed those things to be plain indications that they should be taken also. But for John, he was very little concerned for those whom he had left behind him, but went about among all the people and persuaded them to go to war by the hopes he gave them. He affirmed that the affairs of the Romans were in a weak condition and extolled his own power. He also jested upon the ignorance of the unskillful, as if those Romans, although they should take to themselves wings, could never fly over the wall of Jerusalem, who found such great difficulties in taking the villages of Galilee and had broken their engines of war against their walls.
Thanks, Beth. Does someone want to volunteer to tackle the next paragraph for us?
Sure, I'll take it.
Thanks, Eileen.
These
Harangues.
harangues, thank you, of John's corrupted a great part of the young men and puffed them up for war. But as to the more prudent part, and those in years, there was not a man of them but foresaw what was coming, and made lamentation on that account, as if the city was already undone, and in this confusion were the people. But then it must be observed that the multitude that came out of the country were at discord before the Jerusalem sedition began. For Titus went from Giscala to Cassetes, and Vespasian from Caesarea to Jamnia and Azotus, and took them both. And when he had put garrisons into them, he came back with a great number of the people who were come over to him upon his giving them his right hand for their preservation. There were besides disorders and civil wars in every city, and all those that were at quiet from the Romans turned their hands one against the other. There was also bitter contest between those that were fond of war and those that were desirous of peace, for peace. At first, this quarrelsome temper caught hold of private families who could not agree among themselves, after which those people that were the dearest to one another break through all restraints with regard to each other, and everyone associated with those of his own opinion, and began already to stand in opposition to one another, so that seditions arose everywhere, while those that were for innovations and were desirous of war by their youth and boldness were too hard for the aged and prudent men. And in the first place, all the people of every place betook themselves to rapine, after which they got together in bodies in order to rob the people of the country, insomuch that for barbarity and iniquity, those of the same nation did no way differ from the Romans. Nay, it seemed to be a much lighter thing to be ruined by the Romans. Oops, I missed the bottom of this. Let me try to scroll down. Okay, Romans, than by themselves. Wow, that's mass confusion.
Yeah. So that's his take. Let's remember, Josephus's take on the state of affairs in Jerusalem and thereabouts during this key period in the revolt after the Romans had reconquered the Galilee, but before they'd come to lay siege on Jerusalem. Is anything standing out in particular to people as they were looking through that? Okay, Sharon. Oh, you're on mute, Sharon. Sorry.
The thing about families broken apart sounds very similar to anything political that could be happening today or in recent times. So in that sense, it sounds very true that these kinds of battles with your own are sometimes more bitter than battles with the outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very similar in some respects to some kind of certain aspects of historiography you see around the American Civil War. I think the language is very similar there. Mickey, you had a hand up?
You said what I was going to say. Thank you.
Sorry. Interesting maybe too there that he's focusing on generational differences as one aspect of what's going on when it comes to the decision about whether to fight against the Romans or sue for peace, right? In his version, or at least to his eye, there's a difference between younger men who are maybe more eager for war, more excited to do battle, and the older and more prudent men who are more interested in peace. So there's, at least to Josephus's mind, there's a generational difference here that may also map onto different aspects of these political differences. And that may also explain, some of what he's talking about in terms of the conflict within families, right? Because some members of the families are going to be, in his mind, older and more prudent, and some of them are going to be younger and rasher and more eager for battle, and that's going to result in familial conflict. Anybody else have a comment on this one before we take a look at the next piece?
It almost reminds me of modern times. I mean, you'll get young people speaking out very forcibly. I'm thinking of the young Swedish girl about, we must do something about climate change. And then I'll see, but businesses want to make a profit and want to keep either drilling oil or coal or whatever it is that you want to keep doing. And we're very resistant to that. But the younger generation is like, well, we have to save the planet, and so forth and so on, and you must do something. So it's sort of just reminded me of, that things are still happening. Whereas the older generation who possibly may have some wealth and investments and whatever we have, let's sort of keep things the way they are, and industry and stuff like that. It's a tough battle.
Yeah, I mean, it's not without merit that some people talk about how a study of history helps us understand the ways in which certain aspects of human experience continue happening throughout history, right?
Yeah,
That some of the problems, social and political problems we face in the modern era aren't necessarily all that different from what people may have been facing in certain moments in history back in antiquity, right? And Josephus is certainly presenting things in a way that makes it maybe easy to draw these kind of parallels with stuff that happens in our own time. Joe.
Just as a historical note, the Jews put up one heck of a fight because it took parts of over 10 Roman legions to help put down the revolt. And one Roman legion was completely wiped out. The 22nd Legion, I can't pronounce it anyhow. There's a log of the Roman legions, the list called the Notentia Dignitatum. And after this revolt, the 22nd Legion is completely gone. Mm-hmm. So the Jews did put up quite a fight.
Yeah, that's true.
And so of course, then that led to, Jerusalem being completely destroyed, basically, and reconstituted as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman city.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I want to take some time now to take a look at another piece of text. This piece of text is not from the Jewish War. This one's from his other major work, The Antiquities of the Jews. And like I said, this one is interesting, I think, to me, primarily because of the way in which we are, most of us, pretty darn familiar with the Exodus story as we present it in the Passover Seder every year, right? It's interesting to look at that same story that we tell in a liturgical way that's being viewed instead through this kind of lens of Greco-Roman style history. So I'm going to share the screen once again. I'll tackle the first paragraph and then maybe we'll call for a volunteer. So this is the moment when at the Sea of Reeds. This is to situate us here. He says, when Moses had said this, he led them to the sea, while the Egyptians looked on, for they were within sight. Now these were so distressed by the toil of their pursuit that they thought proper to put off fighting till the next day. But when Moses was come to the seashore, he took his rod and made supplication to God, and called upon him to be their helper and assistant, and said, Thou art not ignorant, O Lord, that it is beyond human strength and human contrivance to avoid the difficulties we are now under. But it must be thy work altogether to procure the deliverance to this army which has left Egypt at thy appointment. We despair of any other assistance or contrivance, and have recourse only to that hope we have in thee. And if there be any method that can promise us an escape by thy providence, we look up to thee for it. And let it come quickly and manifest thy power to us. And do thou raise up this people unto good courage and hope of deliverance, who are deeply sunk into a disconsolate state of mind. We are in a helpless place, but still it is a place that thou possessest. Still the sea is thine, the mountains also that enclose us are thine, so that these mountains will open themselves if thou commandest, them and the sea also if thou commandest it. will become dry land. Nay, we might escape by a flight through the air if thou shouldest determine that we have that way of salvation. When Moses had thus addressed himself to God, he smote the sea with his rod, which parted asunder at the stroke, and receiving those waters to itself, left the ground dry as a road and a place of flight for the Hebrews. Now when Moses saw this appearance of God, and that the sea went out of its own place, and left dry land, he went first of all into it, and bid the Hebrews to follow him along that divine road, and to rejoice at the danger their enemies that followed them were in, and gave thanks to God for this so surprising a deliverance which appeared from him. So I want to kind of stop there for a moment and kind of ask how this is kind of sitting with people, because to me, I think there's some very interesting aspects about this speech that he is attributing to Moses here, that he's putting into Moses's mouth. There's no mention of this specific speech, anything quite like it in the Torah, right? He's kind of making this up, and he's doing it to kind of express what he imagines that Moses would have said in this circumstance. This is a fairly standard thing in historical works of the Greco-Roman period, this kind of speech that's written not based on a specific like account from another source, but rather as like the historian is sort of imagining what this person would have been wanting to say and sort of putting it forward. So what are people, what's coming up to people? Sharon, I see a hand up.
I love it. I love it. It's Midrash. Yeah, he's having this technical conversation with God. You know, he's saying, we know all that you can do. Would you kindly do it? You know, I think it's great.
Yeah.
It also puts it puts a lot of power in Moses' hands. That it's much more a cooperative venture than from above.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's even an element to Moses' speech, which very much places some emphasis on the importance of human action as opposed to divine action. I don't know if anyone else noticed this, but I find it really interesting that he starts out by stating that this situation, it's beyond human strength and human contrivance to avoid the difficulties we're now under. But it must be thy work altogether to procure deliverance of this army, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So he sort of begins his address to God by pointing out that this current situation is beyond human effort to get out of, right? We can't get out of this. And so we're going to have to leave it to you, which seems to imply, to me at least, a general kind of expectation that in most situations that it's up to human beings to take care of themselves, right? To do something for themselves, to engage in heroic action on their own behalf. And I think one thing that I would suggest is that that perspective is highly indicative of a Greco-Roman point of view that tends to regard the sort of active, heroic engagement of, you know, heroic human figures as extremely important and something to be lauded. Any other thoughts, or shall we take another look at another piece of text from this?
It seemed like to me, was he making a suggestion that they kind of like fly over the land or so, or go above the water or something? There was a little part in there that I just caught that was like, wow, you know, he had a pretty cool imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that's, I think another interesting piece about this is it's indicative of the sort of naturalistic perspective of the sort of historian as opposed to the biblical author, right?
Okay.
So think about it this way. Moses, naturalistically, right? If we're like writing a modern novel of this, right? Moses in this moment does not know how the people are going to escape from this. He doesn't know what form God's deliverance is going to take. And so it wouldn't make sense for him only to mention the ocean as like as a way that the people could be saved. So he's mentioning a variety of different things that could, possibly save them. Maybe the mountains move away and we can escape that way. Maybe the sea moves away and we can escape that way. Or maybe he'll make us fly through the air, right? He doesn't know, at least at this moment, how God is going to help out. And so he's presenting a range of possible options that he can imagine, right? That's a way of writing, right, that pays a lot of attention to the question of what does Moses know right now in this point in the narrative, as opposed to later in the narrative, and is trying to preserve naturalistically a sense that, like, at this point, Moses doesn't know certain things that he maybe would know later. And that in and of itself is I think characteristic of a fairly like rationalistic approach to writing narrative and to understanding human psychology as it plays into like a historical the depiction of a historical narrative.
Thank you.
All right. Going to share one other piece of this, which I think might be useful to take a look at, and that's at the very end of this. Can I get someone to volunteer to read these last couple of paragraphs for us?
I can do it.
Thanks, Mickey.
As for myself, I have delivered every part of this history as I found it in the sacred books, nor let anyone wonder of the strangeness of the narration, if a way were discovered to those men of old time who were free from the wickedness of modern ages, whether it happened by the will of God or whether it happened of its own accord. While, for the sake of those that accompanied Alexander, king of Macedonia, who yet lived, comparatively but a little while ago, the Pamphylian Sea retired and afforded them a passage through itself, had no other way to go. I mean, when it was the will of God to destroy the monarchy of the Persians, and this is confessed to be true by all that have written about the actions of Alexander. But as to these events, let everyone determine as he pleases. On the next day, Moses gathered together the weapons of the Egyptians, which were brought to the camp of the Hebrews by the current of the sea, and the force of the winds resisting it. And he conjectured that this also happened by divine providence, so they might not be destitute of weapons. So when he had ordered the Hebrews to arm themselves with them, he led them to Mount Sinai in order to offer sacrifice to God and to render oblations for the salvation of the multitude, as he was charged to do beforehand.
Thanks, Mickey. All right, so there's obviously a number of things going on here. I'm kind of interested to see what people were noticing, though. Let me ask you a question. What do you think his motivation was in talking about the way in which he was delivering the narrative just as he himself received it from, the ancient books of Judaism, right? And in talking about a similar account that is given regarding the armies of Alexander the Great. That whole paragraph where he's talking about this, I'm delivering this narrative to you just as you see it, and as to these events, let everyone determine as he pleases. What do you think is going on in that paragraph?
I don't know, maybe to me it looked like, because he's, I guess, of a military countenance, he was telling us about the weapons that seemed to wash up onto the sea, and he needed the Hebrews to be armed with them, like this was a spoil of war, even though it wasn't exactly war. I mean, they were fleeing the Egyptians, but he seemed to emphasize that to me. That's what I saw.
Yeah, Mickey earlier was mentioning that there's a kind of midrash that's going on here in what he's doing, and I think that this is an example of that in action here in Josephus. The Torah says at one point that when the Israelites go up out of Egypt, they go up armed out of Egypt. And that in and of itself is a kind of curious statement for anyone who's like aware of the, the historical plausibilities of the situation, right?
Yeah, we were slaves. How were we armed? Yeah.
Precisely. The Israelites were slaves and they were escaping slavery. Where did they get all these weapons, right? So Josephus provides some kind of explanation for how it might be that the Israelites went up out of Egypt armed, right? That it turns out the weapons in question were scavenged from the Egyptian army that had been drowned in the waters, right? That the water washed it up on the seashore, and Moses had the people gather up the weapons so they wouldn't be unarmed, right? He's, in other words, filling in the gaps in the story in a way that kind of help it make sense for people that maybe would have been aware of the military kind of questions there and might have been wanting to ask, well, okay, where did all these slaves get all these weapons in the first place? Absolutely. Joe.
Of course, the way it's related is not exactly the way it's in the Torah, but in the Torah there are also books that are mentioned that we have no record of, like the Wars of the Lord. Now, so my question, I guess, my speculation is: did Josephus have access to some of those lost books, and could some of the midrash that he's relating here come from those lost books that we no longer have?
It's not impossible. He's not particularly good about naming his sources, right? So it's a little hard to say for sure, but yeah, that's not entirely impossible, right? And exactly what he's doing, like when he's actually representing something that is coming out of a prior source that he's aware of that we may not have access to, and when he's just sort of using his own understanding to fill in gaps in the story in a way that makes some kind of rational sense, is a little hard to pick apart, right? Because we don't know exactly what sources he had access to. We know he probably would have had access to a lot of the same sources the rabbis would have, but we don't know what else he may have had access to. Mickey, you got a hand up.
Yeah, the whole idea of the splitting of the sea and going through dry shod is pretty implausible. So he brings in Alexander, who's their own historical figure, and this way they could say, oh, this really could have possibly happened through its implausibility.
Exactly. He's addressing himself to a much wider audience than an audience made up solely of Jews, right? Jewish readers could have been maybe expected to accept the biblical account of events at face value and accept it because it's the Torah, and they've been enculturated to believe that the Torah cannot speak anything that is untrue, right? But he's not just writing to Jews, he's also writing to Romans and other peoples of the empire, right? Who may not be predisposed to regard these stories as true stories. And you can detect in the language there in that second to last paragraph a certain desire to make a case for the plausibility of this story, right? To say, oh, actually, there's a parallel story in the history of Alexander that we may be able to point to that's a similar situation. So it's not so implausible. And ultimately, he leaves it a place that is seems to be fairly respectful of anyone who wouldn't want to accept the story as factually true, right? As to these events, let everyone determine as he pleases, right? In other words, you can make your own decision about whether you regard these as factual stories or not. All right. We're getting toward the end of our time here. I want to leave it open for a couple of minutes at least if there's any last questions or thoughts that people want to share before we wrap it up tonight. Okay, Sharon.
In spite of the language, there's something about the way he writes that sounds very modern. And I'm, in my mind, trying to figure out if it's just the sophistications of this broader audience that he's sort of dialoguing with behind the scenes, or if it's something else that feels not that different than the way we might conduct a discussion.
I mean, I think at least to some extent, what we may be noticing there is a characteristic of the fact that modern academic language, right, the language that we're used to reading in, textbooks from college, right, is ultimately based on the sort of classical philosophical literature of late antiquity, right? It used to be that when you were gaining an education in Western Europe, that education would be primarily based on the work of Greek and Roman sage scholars from many, 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 many centuries ago, right? And that same, I think something of that same approach to writing, right? Even through translation from, Greek and Latin into English, right, has sort of preserved itself in the sort of structure of academic discourse, right? In a sense, all modern academic writers are writing in the same mode, or writing in a mode that is ultimately based on, people like Aristotle, right? Everybody who's writing academic stuff is, in some sense, carrying forward a legacy that we can trace back to Aristotle and a number of, Roman philosophers and historians and orators, right, who used to form the sort of basis for any kind of liberal education, right? Not a lot of us are, experts on the classics at this point. That's not necessarily the basis of our educational system today. But I think we still retain a lot of aspects of that language in the way that academic discourse is structured down to the present day. All right. Any other comments before we finish up? All right, let's finish it up there. Thanks, everyone. As usual, I'm recording this. I will put it up on Zoom as soon as I get a chance. And we'll see you here, not next week, but the week after.